It's rare for a television role to become a prison. But for one man, the fame that millions envied nearly consumed him. Before we dive into the story of the actor who defined an era and then disappeared from it, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story that reveals the real human cost behind Hollywood's brightest lights. This is the story of a man who became a household name through one of television's most beloved soap operas, only to find that success can sometimes be the heaviest burden of all. It's a story of triumph, of torment, and of a lifelong search for peace. The story of Anthony Giri, better known to generations of fans as Luke Spencer. When General Hospital first introduced Luke Spencer, few could have guessed that the scruffy, troubled anti-hero would change daytime television forever. Played by a young, magnetic Anthony Giri, Luke wasn't just another soap character, he was a force of nature. The combination of charm and chaos he brought to the screen made him one of the most complex and compelling characters ever written for television. But while audiences fell in love with Luke, the man behind him was fighting battles far more real and painful than any written script could capture. Anthony Giri's journey to stardom began far from Hollywood's glitter. Born in 1947 in a quiet Utah town, Geary grew up surrounded by the values of discipline, modesty, and faith. His parents, both hardworking members of their community, believed in honesty and humility above all else. From an early age, Geary learned to keep his emotions guarded and his ambitions practical. Yet beneath that calm, polite exterior was a boy who dreamed of something bigger. Not fame, but purpose. He wanted to understand the human condition, to tell stories that mattered. Acting wasn't about applause for him. It was about connection. That seriousness led him to the University of Utah, where his professors quickly recognized his talent. Unlike many young actors chasing the spotlight, Geary was drawn to the craft's psychological depth. He studied gesture, silence, and subtext, every tool that could help him disappear into a character. His passion soon caught the attention of Oscar-winning actor Jack Albertson, who saw in the young student something rare, an actor not chasing stardom, but truth. Albertson invited him to join a national stage tour, and for the first time, Geary found himself standing under professional lights. It was there, on stage, that he realized how powerful storytelling could be, not as spectacle, but as revelation. That dedication to honesty in performance made him stand out early in his career. In 1971, he made television history with a guest role on All in the Family, portraying one of TV's first three-dimensional gay characters. It was a bold move in an era when such portrayals were rare and often treated as caricature. But Geary refused to play the role for laughs or pity. Instead, he gave the character dignity, humanity, and pain, and in doing so, he quietly broke barriers. Critics took notice. The performance wasn't just a milestone for representation. It was a glimpse of the empathy and courage that would define his artistry. A few years later, fate intervened again, this time through producer Gloria Monty, who saw something unique in Geary's screen presence. She offered him a short-term role on General Hospital, just 13 weeks, as a morally ambiguous enforcer named Luke Spencer. No one could have predicted what would follow. The character struck a nerve with audiences. Luke was flawed, haunted, often reckless, but also deeply human. He wasn't the polished hero soap fans were used to. He was unpredictable, raw, and magnetic, a man at war with himself. Geary infused him with the same emotional honesty that had defined his early work, and within months, viewers were captivated. What began as a short stint evolved into a phenomenon. Luke's romance with Laura Webber became the emotional center of General Hospital, and their 1981 wedding would become one of the most watched moments in television history, drawing over 30 million viewers. For a daytime show, it was unprecedented. America paused to watch it happen. The wedding wasn't just entertainment, it was an event, a shared cultural heartbeat. Luke Spencer had become more than a character. He was a symbol of redemption, rebellion, and complicated love. And Anthony Giri, whether he liked it or not, was now a star. But fame, as it often does, came with a hidden cost. Behind the scenes, Geary struggled with the weight of expectation. The role that had given him everything also began to consume him. He often described Luke as a ghost that followed him everywhere, a persona the public adored, but one he could never fully escape. Directors, producers, and even fans saw only Luke, never Anthony. His identity, his artistry, even his sense of self were slowly swallowed by the character he had created. For years, he fought silently against that confinement, trying to remind both himself and the industry that there was more to him than Port Charles. He later admitted that fame made him deeply uncomfortable. Unlike many of his peers who thrived on recognition, Geary dreaded it. He hated red carpets, avoided interviews, and often retreated into solitude after filming. The constant attention felt invasive, the adoration suffocating. Fame, he once said, magnifies everything. Your flaws, your fears, your loneliness. And so, while the world saw a charming leading man at the top of his game, the man himself felt increasingly alienated from the very audience that loved him. Those who worked closely with him during that era often spoke of his intensity, how he would pour every ounce of himself into a scene, only to withdraw completely once the cameras stopped rolling. His performances were emotionally volcanic, but his private life was quiet, guarded, and isolated. As years turned into decades, he began to feel trapped by his own success. He longed to play new roles, to explore different stories, but each time he tried to step away, he was pulled back into the orbit of Luke Spencer. The audience wanted him there. The network needed him there. And though the character had made him a legend, it also became a cage. By the time he approached retirement, Geary had spent nearly 4 decades living as someone else, performing a life written for him while his own drifted quietly into the background. Yet through it all, there was a quiet dignity in the way he carried that burden. He never disowned the character or the fans who adored him. He understood what Luke Spencer meant to people, the escapism, the romance, the nostalgia, and he respected that legacy, even as it wore him down. As his final years on General Hospital approached, Geary began to speak more openly about the duality of fame, how something that looks like a dream from the outside can, in truth, feel like a slow unraveling from within. "You give everything to a role," he once said, "but eventually, there's nothing left for yourself." It was a chilling confession from a man who had given his life to storytelling, only to realize that sometimes the story takes more than it gives back. And so began the quiet retreat, a search not for applause, but for peace. But even in stepping away from the limelight, Anthony Giri would leave behind a legacy that reshaped television and inspired a generation of actors who saw in his work not just performance, but truth.
When Anthony Giri finally walked away from General Hospital in 2015, it was not a decision made out of resentment. It was survival. After 37 years of embodying Luke Spencer, he knew he had reached a crossroads. Either he would keep playing the same role until he vanished into it completely, or he would reclaim his life while there was still time. The final episode he filmed was emotional not because of the plot, but because everyone watching, cast, crew, and fans alike, could feel the weight of goodbye. It was the end of an era, not just for General Hospital, but for daytime television as a whole. Luke Spencer was riding off into the sunset, and with him, so was one of the last true legends of soap opera storytelling. But behind that quiet exit was a man who had been planning his escape for years. Geary's decision wasn't sudden. It had been slowly building, scene by scene, year after year. He had spoken often about feeling trapped by Luke's popularity, about the creative suffocation that came from being seen as only one thing. Every time he left the show and returned, the cycle repeated. Promises of new storylines, renewed attention, and then the same emotional exhaustion that followed. By his final return in 2013, Geary knew it was the last one. He wanted closure, not for Luke, but for himself. His farewell performance reflected that internal struggle. Luke's final scenes were layered with unspoken meaning, as if Geary was channeling all the years of love, fatigue, and bittersweet gratitude he carried. When the camera faded to black, it wasn't just a fictional character ending his journey. It was Anthony Giri stepping away from a lifetime of expectation. Afterward, he told interviewers he was grateful, but also relieved. He loved the work, but not the attention. Fame, he admitted, had always been something he endured rather than enjoyed. That confession was telling, because Geary's discomfort with fame had been present from the very beginning. Even at the height of his success in the 1980s, he was known for avoiding the spotlight. While other soap stars appeared at fan conventions and interviews, he often declined, preferring to keep his private life entirely separate from the public image of Luke Spencer. For years, fans speculated about his personal life because he never spoke about it. Not his family, not his relationships, not even his off-screen interests. He believed that an actor's life should remain invisible. That mystery protected the magic of performance. But the more successful he became, the harder that separation was to maintain. Every tabloid, every interview request, every headline that mentioned his name made him retreat further into isolation. He lived quietly, often disappearing between filming seasons to faraway places, Europe, South America, or remote parts of California, where he could walk down a street without being recognized. In a rare interview, he once said, "Anonymity is freedom. It's the ability to exist without having to explain yourself." That sentence encapsulated the contradiction of his career. The man who had become one of television's most recognizable faces spent his entire life trying not to be seen. The pressures of fame didn't just make him withdrawn, they made him unwell. By the late 1990s, friends noticed that Geary was drinking more heavily, often to numb the exhaustion that came from constantly performing. He also battled depression, something he later described as the shadow that fame casts. He spoke about the loneliness of success, how the adoration of millions couldn't fill the quiet ache of disconnection that came once the cameras stopped rolling. Like many actors who give too much of themselves to their art, he struggled to find balance between who he was and who the world wanted him to be. At times, that struggle became visible even in his work. During the show's darker storylines, viewers noticed an intensity in his performance that went beyond script. There was something raw and restless in his eyes, a weariness that mirrored the emotional toll fame had taken. And yet, even through that pain, he continued to deliver extraordinary performances, layered, human, and heartbreakingly honest. His ability to channel real emotion into his art became both his gift and his curse. The paradox of Anthony Giri was that he never wanted stardom, yet he pursued excellence with relentless precision. Every time he stepped onto a set, he demanded truth, not just from himself, but from everyone around him. Fellow actors often said he would push scenes further than written, improvising dialogue or physical moments until they felt real. That authenticity made him a legend among his peers. But when the director yelled cut, that same intensity would fade into silence. He rarely socialized after filming, preferring to retreat to his dressing room or his modest Los Angeles home, where he lived alone for many years. As his career went on, he began to reject the rituals of celebrity altogether. He stopped attending award shows, even though he won 8 Daytime Emmy Awards, one of the highest tallies in soap opera history. He refused to campaign for recognition, refused to give acceptance speeches, and often mailed his trophies to friends instead of displaying them. To him, awards were symbols of something superficial, a public measure of success that meant little compared to private peace. What he wanted was to be left alone, to create without the constant noise of fame. His colleagues respected that, though many didn't understand it. In a world where most actors crave recognition, Geary seemed to move in the opposite direction, shedding fame like a skin he no longer needed. Even in interviews, he would downplay his achievements, crediting others instead. He often said that the most important lesson he learned in Hollywood was how to remain invisible, how to preserve the parts of himself that fame could never touch. That humility stemmed from his upbringing. Growing up in a modest Utah family, he had learned early on that hard work mattered more than attention. His father was a building contractor, his mother, a homemaker who believed in faith and structure. Life in their small community was simple, even austere. The values of honesty, modesty, and diligence were instilled in him from childhood. These roots grounded him, even as he became one of television's biggest names. And yet, they also made fame feel unnatural to him, something at odds with who he was raised to be. Despite all that discomfort, Anthony Giri never disrespected the art of acting itself. He saw performance as a sacred exchange, a way of revealing human truths without judgment or ego. That belief carried him through every role, from early-stage productions to soap opera melodrama. Even when he despised the fame attached to Luke Spencer, he treated the craft with reverence. It was his anchor, his therapy, and his identity. But by the time he reached his late 60s, he realized that art alone could no longer sustain him. What he needed now was peace, not applause. And so, after decades of living for others' stories, he decided to write his own, quietly, deliberately, and far away from the world that had once consumed him. After leaving General Hospital, Anthony Giri disappeared almost entirely from public life, not in scandal or bitterness, but in a quiet act of self-preservation. He didn't announce a grand farewell tour or sign a book deal. Instead, he simply vanished into a life of privacy, something he had spent decades yearning for. For fans who had watched him every day for nearly 4 decades, his silence was deafening. Reporters speculated about where he'd gone, what he was doing, and whether he'd ever return to acting. But the truth, as it turned out years later, was far more peaceful and far more meaningful than anyone expected. Geary had moved to Europe, settling in Amsterdam, a city that mirrored the kind of life he had always wanted, cultured, quiet, and anonymous. There, in a modest canal-side home, he lived with a man named Claudio Gama, a person very few outside his close circle even knew existed. The two had been partners for decades, though Geary had kept that part of his life completely private. It wasn't until 2025, long after his retirement, that fans learned through a simple Instagram post that Geary and Gama had been together for over 30 years. The revelation wasn't a publicity stunt or a confession. It was a rare, gentle glimpse into a man who had finally found the courage to live on his own terms. That post, showing the two sitting together on a sunlit balcony, surrounded by books and flowers, broke the internet in the most unexpected way. Fans weren't angry or shocked. They were moved. For years, they had known Geary as the complex, brooding Luke Spencer, but now they saw him as something even more real, a man who had loved quietly, who had chosen peace over fame, who had built a life of authenticity far away from the noise of celebrity. It became one of those rare moments in Hollywood history when an actor's real life felt even more inspiring than the roles they played. For Geary, that peace didn't come easily. The transition from constant performance to anonymity was disorienting at first. In interviews given before his full retirement, he hinted that he worried about losing purpose once the cameras stopped rolling. For so long, he had lived on sets, memorizing lines, inhabiting other people's emotions. Acting wasn't just a job, it was the structure of his entire life. But in Amsterdam, he discovered something new, the simple rhythm of ordinary days. Morning walks by the canals, reading for hours without interruption, cooking with Claudio, writing letters instead of emails. It was a slow, deliberate life, one that finally allowed him to exist without performing. That period of reinvention also revealed how deeply introspective Geary was. Friends who visited him abroad described a man surrounded by books, not trophies, literature, philosophy, poetry, and art. He read voraciously, often quoting Shakespeare or Rilke in casual conversation. He believed that solitude was not emptiness, but space, a necessary distance from the chaos of the world that allowed him to think, reflect, and heal. For someone who had spent decades pretending to be other people, rediscovering himself became his final great role. But perhaps what surprised people most was how happy he seemed in that simplicity. The man once haunted by depression and the weight of fame had found balance. Those who knew him in Amsterdam spoke of his calm presence, his dry humor, his fascination with history and language. He became known among his neighbors as a quiet American who loved classical music and never talked about Hollywood. There is no trace of Luke Spencer in him anymore. No trace of the turmoil or exhaustion that once defined his life. Instead, he seemed finally at peace, living out the years in quiet companionship with the man he loved. That long-hidden relationship with Claudio Gama told the world more about Anthony Giri than any interview ever could. For decades, he had protected that love fiercely, not out of shame, but out of reverence for its privacy. In an industry built on exposure and image, Geary's silence was a form of devotion. The world didn't need to know, it only needed to respect. His private life was not for consumption, not for gossip, not for headlines. It was his sanctuary. And when he finally chose to share it, he did so on his own terms, with the grace and humility that had always defined him. What made that revelation even more touching was how it reframed his earlier life. Suddenly, fans could see the pattern. The avoidance of interviews, the quietness off-screen, the years spent traveling alone. It wasn't aloofness or arrogance, as some had assumed. It was protection. He was protecting the most meaningful parts of himself from a world that demanded constant visibility. It's hard to imagine how heavy that must have been to live a double life not for scandal, but for peace. And yet, that choice made sense for a man who had spent his career understanding the fragility of human emotion. In retrospect, his withdrawal from Hollywood was not an escape, it was a reclamation. For the first time in decades, Anthony Giri belonged to himself. He no longer needed the validation of cameras, scripts, or awards. He had spent years telling other people's stories. Now, he was living his own, quietly and truthfully. And while many fans wished he had continued acting, those who truly understood him knew that this ending, this stillness, was the most fitting chapter of all. Over time, Geary's story began to take on a mythic quality. In an industry obsessed with reinvention and visibility, he had done the opposite. He had walked away and stayed away. Younger actors began to cite him as an example of integrity, of what it meant to value artistry over attention. To them, he wasn't just Luke Spencer or the face of General Hospital. He was proof that a performer could shape a culture and then step aside without losing themselves to it. Even in absence, his legacy grew. Fans online often revisit his most iconic scenes, the pain, the passion, the wit, and marvel at how ahead of his time he was. He wasn't performing for effect. He was performing from truth. His characters weren't designed to please audiences, but to challenge them, to make them feel something authentic. And perhaps that's why, decades later, Anthony Giri's name still carries weight, not just as a soap star, but as an artist who turned daytime drama into something that felt like poetry. In the end, what Anthony Giri found wasn't fame, fortune, or immortality. It was freedom. The kind of freedom that comes from knowing who you are and what truly matters. His final act wasn't on screen, but in the quiet life he built afterward, one of love, honesty, and contentment. For a man who once said he wanted to disappear, it's ironic how deeply he continues to resonate, not as a celebrity, but as a reminder that the greatest performance of all is learning how to live authentically. In the decades that followed his departure from the spotlight, Anthony Giri's life took on a reflective rhythm, the kind that only emerges after years of noise and exhaustion. To those who knew him best, he seemed to be rewriting his own story in private, replacing the chaos of fame with quiet acts of meaning. He spent mornings reading by the window, afternoons walking through Amsterdam's cobbled streets, and evenings listening to music with Claudio Gama. There was nothing grand about it, nothing cinematic, and that was precisely the point. After 40 years of living in front of millions, he had finally found the joy of being invisible. But even in his self-imposed exile, the ghost of Luke Spencer lingered. Fans still sent letters to the network, hoping he might one day return for a cameo, a special episode, a final goodbye. Occasionally, rumors would surface that he had been spotted back in Los Angeles, that he was considering a memoir, that producers were courting him for a tribute. But Geary had made up his mind. He had said everything he needed to say through his work. His silence became part of his legacy. To him, the best ending was not a curtain call, but an open door, a story left quietly unfinished. That philosophy defined his later years. Geary often spoke, in rare private conversations, about the danger of letting one's art consume one's identity. He believed that actors, especially those who played long-running characters, often forgot who they truly were. The hardest thing, he once told a friend, is learning to stop pretending. It wasn't cynicism. It was wisdom hard-earned through decades of living as someone else. He knew what it meant to disappear into a role so completely that the world forgot. And so did you, that you were ever anyone else. In a way, that disappearance mirrored his internal journey. For years, Geary had wrestled with depression. Not the dramatic, visible kind, but a quieter, chronic weight that followed him even during his career's brightest moments. Fame had amplified it. Solitude finally softened it. Away from the cameras, he discovered stillness. He began to meditate, to paint, to write small essays that he never published. Claudio once told a mutual friend that Geary treated every morning as a new rehearsal for peace. That image, the actor rehearsing not for applause, but for calm, said everything about who he had become. And yet, he never disowned his past. When fans occasionally encountered him by chance in Amsterdam, in a cafe, or at an art gallery, they would sometimes recognize him, decades older but unmistakable. They would approach him with reverence, often nervous, expecting rejection. Instead, Geary would smile, thank them softly, and tell them how much their loyalty meant. He may have fled the spotlight, but he never forgot the people who gave him the chance to shine. His gratitude remained as deep as his humility. Still, there was always an unspoken distance, the quiet boundary he had built between his public and private lives. He rarely discussed Luke Spencer anymore, but when he did, he spoke with both affection and fatigue. Luke was like a twin I never asked for, he once said. We shared everything, and it nearly killed us both. That line, both poetic and haunting, encapsulated the paradox of his legacy. The character that had made him immortal also consumed his identity, leaving him with a lifelong task of separating man from myth. As time went on, he found that separation through art. Though he never returned to acting, Geary remained a creative soul. He wrote essays on theater, explored photography, and even contributed anonymously to a few European stage productions as a script consultant. His ideas about performance, about truth, vulnerability, and restraint influenced a new generation of artists who saw acting not as fame, but as craft. To them, Geary was a teacher they never met, a guiding spirit who had shown that integrity was more valuable than visibility. Those who visited his Amsterdam home often described it as a sanctuary. The walls were lined with books and old photographs, some from his early stage days, others from travels with Claudio. There were no awards on display, no reminders of Hollywood. Instead, the house reflected his philosophy. Art belongs in the heart, not on the mantelpiece. He had created a space for reflection rather than recognition, a place where life was lived moment by moment, without cameras, without scripts, without expectation. In those quiet years, he also became deeply introspective about mortality. Friends recall him often saying that he wanted to leave behind something more lasting than fame, an emotional legacy, not a professional one. He believed that the truest art was how one lived, not what one created. That belief shaped everything he did in his final decades. He mentored young actors informally, often reminding them to never confuse applause for love. He warned them that success was addictive, that fame could feel like oxygen until it turned into smoke. Many of those who heard him speak of these things later described his words as life-changing. There was something almost monastic about the way he lived. He rose early, read poetry aloud, tended to his garden, and often cooked meals from scratch. Claudio, ever the quieter presence, shared his routines, his silences, his laughter. They were partners in the truest sense, not defined by grand gestures, but by small acts of kindness and understanding. For Geary, who had spent years performing love on screen, this was the real thing, simple, grounded, and private. And though he rarely looked back on his Hollywood years, when he did, it was with compassion. He no longer resented the industry that had once confined him. He understood it for what it was, a machine that celebrated youth, drama, and spectacle, often at the cost of the soul. But he also knew that within that machine, he had found his voice, his artistry, and his audience. He often said that General Hospital gave him a mirror to see who I was, even when I didn't want to. That acceptance marked a quiet peace between the man and his creation. In the end, Anthony Giri's life became its own kind of performance. Not one played out on screen, but lived in full awareness of what mattered most. He had spent decades pretending to be Luke Spencer, the flawed hero who always returned to save the day. But off-screen, the hero's journey was inward. It wasn't about saving anyone else. It was about rescuing himself from fame, from expectation, from the endless performance of being someone he wasn't. By the time he reached his late 70s, Geary had transformed from an actor defined by fame to a man defined by grace. His story wasn't one of tragedy or scandal, but of evolution. The rare tale of a performer who had the courage to walk away while still beloved, to choose life over legacy, love over applause. And in doing so, he gave his fans one final, unspoken message: that the truest form of greatness is not being remembered by millions, but being at peace with oneself. There's something almost poetic about how Anthony Giri's life unfolded, as if every chapter, from his small-town beginnings to his retreat into anonymity, was written with quiet intentionality. He had lived through the kind of fame that could easily destroy a person, and yet, instead of breaking under its weight, he slowly dismantled it, piece by piece, until nothing remained but himself. By the time he settled fully into his Amsterdam life, he had achieved what few in his industry ever do. He had made peace with the past. In many ways, Geary's story mirrored the characters he had once portrayed, full of contradiction, passion, and redemption. But unlike Luke Spencer, his real life didn't need melodrama or spectacle. It was rooted in truth. He had come to understand that the stage, for all its glory, was never meant to be home. Acting, for him, was a means of discovery, not definition. And after decades of playing roles written by others, he had finally become the author of his own narrative. He often spoke, in rare interviews or conversations with friends, about how acting had both saved and consumed him. It gave him purpose and expression, but it also blurred his sense of reality. "You begin to mistake applause for affection," he once said. "And when the applause stops, you realize how much of your soul you gave away to earn it." That recognition came to define his philosophy in later life. He believed that art should serve truth, not ego, that an actor's purpose was to reveal humanity, not to become worshipped for it. That perspective was radical in a world obsessed with celebrity. While most stars chased visibility, Geary built his life around invisibility. Fame had become, in his words, a costume I couldn't take off, and retirement was his way of shedding it completely. In Amsterdam, no one cared who he had once been. There were no paparazzi, no fan conventions, no nostalgic reminders of his television past. For the first time, he was free to live without being seen. He wasn't Luke Spencer anymore. He wasn't even Anthony Giri, the Emmy-winning legend. He was just Anthony, a man who read, wrote, cooked, and loved. And yet, the artistic spark never left him. Those who knew him said that even in his quiet life, he still carried himself like an actor, deliberate, curious, deeply observant. He would sit in cafes and watch people for hours, studying their gestures, their silences, the rhythm of their conversations. Acting had trained him to see the world differently, to notice subtleties most others missed. It wasn't performance anymore, it was perception. Art had simply evolved from something he did to something he lived. In those moments of observation, Geary found connection again. Not the overwhelming kind that fame brings, but the subtle, genuine kind that exists between strangers sharing space. He became fascinated by ordinary life. Parents walking children to school, an elderly couple arguing softly over pastries, a street musician playing for coins and smiles. These were the moments he once recreated on screen, now experienced in real time. They reminded him of why he fell in love with acting in the first place, to capture life as it truly is. Claudio often said that Anthony's happiest days were the quietest ones. No grand adventures, no luxury trips, just small joys, a good book, a walk by the water, the laughter of friends. He found beauty in simplicity. After years of performing emotion, he had finally learned to feel it without artifice. Love wasn't written in dialogue or rehearsed for an audience. It was lived in glances, gestures, and shared silence. For a man who had once been known for his intensity, there was now an undeniable softness to him, a gentleness that came from finally understanding that peace was not something to chase, but something to allow. In reflecting on his life, Geary often credited his upbringing for grounding him. Growing up in a small Mormon household in Utah, he was taught to work hard, to stay humble, and to keep his word. Those lessons, though once at odds with Hollywood's excess, had quietly guided him through his most difficult years. He never lost that sense of duty to his craft, even when fame twisted it into something heavier. He respected the stage, the camera, and the audience with the reverence of a craftsman. Acting, for him, was sacred work. That's what made his performances so enduring. They weren't about pretending, but revealing. It's easy to romanticize his later life as idyllic, but it wasn't without its shadows. He still carried scars from the years when depression and addiction nearly destroyed him. He spoke occasionally of that period, not to seek pity, but to acknowledge the truth. Fame gives you permission to self-destruct in public, he once said, and people call it charisma. He had seen how the industry enabled excess, how it rewarded pain disguised as passion. Overcoming that took courage. His escape to Europe wasn't just about leaving a career, it was about choosing to live. In Amsterdam, he built a new kind of legacy, one not measured in awards or ratings, but in authenticity. He mentored aspiring actors quietly, often through letters or private workshops. He told them that acting wasn't about being seen, but about seeing. You can't play truthfully, he said, if you're afraid of silence. It was advice born from experience, from decades of learning that the loudest applause often hides the deepest loneliness. His students, even those who never met him in person, spoke of his wisdom with reverence. To them, he wasn't a celebrity, he was a philosopher in disguise. And that, perhaps, was Anthony Giri's greatest transformation. He went from being the face of television drama to a quiet mentor, a living reminder that art and life should never be separated. His story wasn't a fall from grace. It was an ascent into authenticity. He had reached the summit of fame, looked down, and realized the view wasn't worth the climb. What mattered was not how many people remembered his name, but how deeply he understood himself. Every now and then, his fans still post tributes online. Clips of Luke Spencer's greatest moments, old interviews, photos from the 1980s. But what's remarkable is how often those posts turn reflective. Instead of simply praising his talent, people talk about his honesty, his vulnerability, his humanity. They sense, even through decades-old footage, the inner truth he carried into every performance. That was Anthony's real gift, the ability to make the fictional feel real and the real feel timeless. For those who watched him from the beginning, his journey feels like a full circle. The man who once played a character defined by conflict and redemption ultimately lived that very arc himself. His story, the rise, the struggle, the retreat, and the peace became a kind of parable for what it means to survive fame without losing your soul. In an age where celebrity often consumes authenticity, Anthony Giri became a rare exception. A man who proved that true greatness isn't in being idolized, it's in learning how to be free. In the final years of his life, Anthony Giri's world grew smaller, not from isolation, but from intention. He believed deeply in the idea that fulfillment wasn't found in expansion, but in refinement, in knowing what to keep and what to let go. His Amsterdam home, overlooking a quiet canal, became both sanctuary and stage. Walls lined with books, shelves filled with old film reels, and scripts marked with his handwritten notes. A single Emmy displayed, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of a life once lived in public. He'd sit near the window most mornings, sunlight on his face, a cup of black coffee beside him, as if rehearsing the simplest and most profound role he had ever played, that of being content. Those who visited him, friends, former colleagues, the occasional journalist granted rare access, often described an atmosphere of calm so palpable it felt rehearsed, though it wasn't. Geary had mastered stillness. There was no trace of performance left in him. The charisma that once electrified millions now radiated quietly, naturally. When he spoke, it was slow and deliberate, as though he wanted every word to earn its place. "The world taught me to speak loudly," he once said. "Now I'm teaching myself to whisper." He never returned to America permanently after leaving the set of General Hospital. The life he left behind remained frozen in memory. A different man, a different century. And yet, his influence lingered there in the generations of actors who still cited him as a master of naturalism, in the soap opera fans who continued to revisit Luke and Laura's wedding as if it were a sacred relic of television history. He didn't need to be present for his legacy to breathe. It lived on, quietly and persistently, like a song that never quite fades. Anthony often said that the older he got, the more he believed in impermanence. "Everything ends," he told a friend during a recorded conversation years before his death. "The question is whether you end bitter or you end free." For him, freedom came from surrender, from accepting that stories, even great ones, don't last forever. He viewed life as a performance that must eventually close its curtain, not in tragedy, but in peace. If you can walk off stage smiling, he said, then you've done it right. When he passed away, it wasn't with spectacle or announcement. The news surfaced quietly, almost fittingly, weeks later, a brief mention in European papers before Hollywood took notice. Fans mourned him not just as an actor, but as a soul who had dared to live differently. Tributes poured in from around the world, though what stood out most were the personal stories. The extras, the crew members, the small-town actors he had encouraged along the way. Their recollections painted a portrait not of a star, but of a man who gave light freely and never demanded it back. The General Hospital set held a moment of silence. The lights dimmed, and old clips played on monitors around the studio. For a brief moment, time folded in on itself. The man who had once defined the show, whose storylines had captivated a nation, was gone, but somehow still present in every frame. Even the youngest cast members, who had never worked with him directly, felt the weight of what he represented. A standard of artistry and authenticity that television rarely sees anymore. Back in Amsterdam, Claudio arranged for Geary's ashes to be scattered along the Amstel River, near the small bridge where they had walked together countless evenings. The ceremony was intimate, just a few close friends, no press, no eulogies. As the ashes met the water, the sky turned a muted orange, and the wind carried the faint sound of a street violinist playing a tune, neither mournful nor joyous, just human. It was, as Claudio later said, exactly the way Anthony would have wanted it. Real, simple, and beautiful. Afterward, in the weeks that followed, letters began to arrive from across the world. Some came from former co-stars, others from strangers whose lives had been touched by his performances or his words. One note, written by a young actor from Los Angeles, captured what many felt. "You taught me that acting isn't about pretending to be someone else. It's about daring to be seen for who you are. You didn't just play truth, you lived it. Thank you." If there was one legacy Anthony Giri left behind, It was the courage to be seen without the mask. He had spent decades hiding behind characters, only to realize that the greatest act of all was to stop performing entirely. In the end, his story wasn't about fame or even art. It was about liberation, the long, slow process of peeling away everything false until only truth remained. And so, the man once worshipped as Luke Spencer, America's most complicated romantic hero, passed quietly into history. But his life, full of triumph, collapse, reinvention, and peace, endures as a kind of lesson for anyone who's ever lost themselves chasing applause. Anthony Giri proved that redemption doesn't always come in the grand gesture or the final scene. Sometimes it comes in the quiet, in a morning by the canal, a shared laugh, a slow exhale of gratitude for the life you've lived. The curtain fell softly and completely, and for once, he didn't need to take a bow.